Billionaire's son mocks black waitress in German. Her fluent response stuns him. What if one moment of cruelty could change two lives forever? On a quiet Tuesday evening at Heidelberg Cafe in downtown Chicago, 45-year-old Margaret Washington wiped down the corner table where she'd served countless meals over the past 15 years. Her gentle hands moved with practiced grace, the same hands that had once held textbooks in Berlin, that had written love letters to her late husband James, and that now carried the weight of a story few would ever guess. The dinner rush was winding down, and Margaret hummed softly to herself, a German lullaby her grandmother had taught her decades ago. She didn't notice the young man in the expensive suit watching her from across the room. His eyes filled with the kind of entitlement that money can buy but wisdom cannot. What happened next would test everything Margaret believed about forgiveness, dignity, and the power of a single, perfectly chosen response. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Margaret had always believed that every person who walked through Heidelberg Cafe's doors carried their own story, their own struggles and joys hidden beneath the surface. She'd learned this lesson long ago, back when she was studying literature at the University of Berlin in the early 2000s, before life led her across the ocean to Chicago, before she met James, before the dreams she'd once held transformed into something entirely different but no less meaningful. Now, as she moved between tables with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of practice, she found peace in the simple act of caring for others. The cafe itself was a warm haven on Ashland Avenue, with its exposed brick walls lined with old photographs of Germany and the soft glow of pendant lights casting golden shadows across worn wooden tables. Regular customers knew Margaret by name, and she knew their usual orders by heart. Mrs. Rodriguez always wanted her coffee black with just a hint of cinnamon, and young Tommy from the college down the street never could decide between the schnitzel and the bratwurst until Margaret gently suggested what would suit his mood that day. But tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the way the autumn wind rattled the windows, or maybe it was the strange tension she sensed from the well-dressed young man who'd taken the table by the window. Christopher Brennan Jr. had arrived alone, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the cafe's hardwood floors with an authority that seemed to announce his presence before he'd even spoken. At 28, he carried himself with a particular arrogance that comes from never having wanted for anything, never having to earn respect, never having learned that money could buy comfort but not character. Margaret approached his table with the same warm smile she offered every customer. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent that decades in America had softened but never quite erased. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Christopher barely looked up from his phone, his fingers scrolling through messages that seemed far more important than acknowledging the woman standing beside him. When he finally spoke, his words came out sharp and dismissive. "Just get me the most expensive bottle of wine you have. And make it quick." Something in his tone made Margaret pause, but she maintained her composure. Years of service had taught her patience with all kinds of people, even those who seemed determined to make her work harder than necessary. "Of course," she replied gently. "I'll be right back with our wine list." As she walked away, Christopher's eyes followed her movement, and something ugly stirred in his chest. Maybe it was the stress from his father's latest business deal, or perhaps it was the argument he'd had with his girlfriend about his attitude problem, but tonight he felt particularly inclined to take his frustrations out on someone who couldn't fight back. He watched Margaret return with a wine list, noticed the careful way she set it down, the respectful distance she maintained while explaining the selections. The other diners in the cafe continued their quiet conversations, unaware that the evening was about to take a turn that would challenge everything they thought they knew about dignity, respect, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Margaret felt the shift in the air, the way a storm seems to gather tension before it breaks, but she continued serving with the same grace she'd shown for 15 years. Never imagining that her past was about to collide with her present in a way that would test not just her patience, but her very soul. The wine Christopher selected cost more than Margaret earned in 3 days, but she poured it with the same careful attention she gave every task, her movements practiced and dignified. As she set the glass before him, he took a sip and made an exaggerated face of disgust, though the wine was perfectly fine. The other customers seemed to sense something was amiss. Conversations grew quieter, and several people glanced toward their table with growing unease. "This wine tastes terrible," Christopher announced loudly, his voice carrying across the small cafe. "I should have known better than to expect quality in a place like this." Margaret's heart sank, but she maintained her professional composure. In her years of service, she'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some people were determined to be unhappy no matter what she did. "I'm sorry you're not satisfied," she replied calmly. "Would you like to try something different? Or perhaps I could." "No, what I'd like," Christopher interrupted, his voice growing nastier, "is for people to actually do their jobs properly." He looked around the cafe deliberately, making sure others could hear. "But I suppose that's expecting too much these days." Margaret felt the familiar sting of disrespect, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times over the years from customers who seemed to believe that paying for a meal gave them the right to treat service workers as less than human. But she'd also learned something else in her 4.5 decades of life, that responding to cruelty with more cruelty only multiplied the pain in the world. "I understand you're frustrated," she said quietly, her accent more pronounced now as emotions threatened to overtake her professional calm. "Let me see what I can do to make this better." But Christopher wasn't finished. Perhaps encouraged by what he mistook for weakness, he leaned back in his chair and spoke deliberately in German, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dies dumm alte Frau verstet wahrscheinlich nicht einmal, was ich sage. Typisch für solche Leute." The words hung in the air like poison, roughly translating to cruel assumptions about Margaret's intelligence and worth based solely on her appearance and occupation. The cafe fell silent. Even customers who didn't understand German could sense the viciousness in his tone, the deliberate cruelty of using a foreign language to mock someone he assumed couldn't understand. An elderly gentleman at the corner table actually started to stand up, his face flushed with indignation, while a young couple near the door exchanged shocked glances. Margaret stood perfectly still for a moment, her hands clasped gently in front of her. In that silence, she felt the weight of every insult she'd endured over the years, every moment when someone had judged her worth by the color of her skin or the work she did rather than the person she was. But she also felt something else. The strength that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The other diners watched, some with anger at the young man's behavior, others with sympathy for Margaret, all of them waiting to see how this moment would unfold. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. What happened next would depend entirely on how Margaret chose to respond to such deliberate cruelty, and whether she would allow this young man's ignorance to diminish her dignity or use it as an opportunity to teach a lesson that no amount of money could buy. The silence in Heidelberg Cafe stretched like a held breath, and Margaret felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. This was the moment that could break her spirit or reveal the strength she'd carried through decades of life's challenges. She thought of James, her late husband, who used to tell her that education was a light that could never be extinguished, no matter how dark the world around you became. She thought of her grandmother in Berlin, who had whispered stories and songs in German during the hardest days of her childhood, making that language a gift rather than a burden. Christopher sat smugly in his chair, apparently pleased with himself for what he believed was a clever insult delivered in a language this simple waitress couldn't possibly understand. He took another sip of wine, savoring what he thought was his moment of superiority, completely unaware that he had just revealed far more about himself than about the woman he sought to humiliate. Margaret took a quiet breath, feeling the familiar cadence of her grandmother's language rising in her chest like a song she'd never forgotten. When she spoke, her voice was clear and measured, each German word pronounced with the precision of someone who had studied the language formally, who had lived it, breathed it, and loved it long before this cruel young man had learned it as a marker of his privilege. "Entschuldigen Sie, junger Mann," she began, her accent now clearly that of someone who had mastered the language through years of dedicated study. "Aber ich glaub, Sie haben sich geirrt. Ich habe in Berlin studiert, wo ich gelernt have, das war Bildung nicht nur im Sprechen einer Sprache liegt, sondern darin, sie mit Respekt die Wort zu verwenden." Her words flowed like music, explaining that she had studied in Berlin, where she learned that true education lay not just in speaking a language, but in using it with respect and dignity. The transformation in the cafe was immediate. Christopher's face went from smug satisfaction to shock, then to something approaching panic as he realized his assumption had been not just wrong, but catastrophically so. The other diners began to understand what had happened, and several people actually smiled with satisfaction at seeing the tables turned so elegantly. But Margaret wasn't finished. She continued in German, her voice growing stronger. Echt Klasse Zeit sich nicht durch den Preis der Kleidung oder das Geld auf dem Bankkonto, sondern durch die Art, wie man andere Menschen behandelt. Das hatten ihr Eltern ihnen beibringen sollen. She explained that real class wasn't shown through expensive clothes or bank accounts, but through how one treated other people, something his parents should have taught him. Then, seamlessly switching back to English, Margaret's voice carried a weight of authority that filled the room. Young man, I've served in this cafe for 15 years. I've met millionaires who said please and thank you, and I've met people with hardly a dollar to their name who treated me with more dignity than you've shown tonight. The language you choose to speak says nothing about your intelligence. How you choose to treat others says everything about your character. The entire cafe seemed to collectively exhale, and spontaneous applause broke out from several tables. Christopher looked around desperately, realizing that his attempt to humiliate someone else had completely backfired, exposing his own character in the harshest possible light. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments how you might have handled such a situation. Margaret stood calmly beside his table, not with triumph or anger, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had just proven that respect cannot be bought. Education comes in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply to reveal the truth with grace. Christopher's hands trembled slightly as he set down his wine glass, the liquid sloshing against the sides. For perhaps the first time in his 28 years, he found himself completely speechless, confronted not with the fury he might have expected, but with something far more powerful, quiet dignity that made his own behavior appear smaller and more pathetic with each passing second. The murmur of approval from other diners only intensified his growing awareness of how badly he had misjudged not just Margaret, but the entire situation. Margaret remained standing beside his table, not gloating over her linguistic victory, but watching him with something unexpected in her eyes. Not anger, but a kind of patient sadness that suggested she had seen this type of behavior before, and understood something about it that he didn't yet comprehend. You know, she said gently, switching back to English, my late husband James used to say that when people lash out at others, they're usually fighting something inside themselves that has nothing to do with the person they're hurting. The words hit Christopher harder than any angry response could have. He thought about the argument with his girlfriend Rebecca, who had accused him of being empty inside despite all his advantages. He thought about his father's constant disappointment, always pushing him to prove himself worthy of the family name and fortune. He thought about how isolated he felt despite having everything money could buy, and how that loneliness had transformed into the kind of bitterness that made him want to hurt others simply because he was hurting. I studied German literature at the Universität Berlin for 3 years, Margaret continued, her voice taking on a storytelling quality that seemed to cast a spell over the entire cafe. I was going to be a professor, specializing in the works of Goethe and Schiller. But life had other plans. I met my James at a cafe much like this one, fell in love, came to America, and built a different kind of life. Not the one I planned, but the one I was meant to live. She paused, glancing around at the faces watching her with rapt attention, then looked back at Christopher with genuine concern. I've learned that every person's story is more complex than what we see on the surface. You came in here tonight angry about something that had nothing to do with me or this cafe. Maybe you needed someone to take that anger out on, and I seemed like a safe target. Christopher felt tears prick his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation that both embarrassed and surprised him. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words feeling foreign in his mouth because he so rarely had to use them. You're right. My girlfriend says I'm angry all the time now, and I don't even know why. Margaret nodded with understanding, then did something that shocked everyone in the cafe, including Christopher himself. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, transforming their interaction from a service encounter into something far more human. Would you like to tell me about it? She asked simply. Sometimes talking to a stranger helps more than talking to people who know us too well. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales like this one. The conversation that followed would challenge everything Christopher thought he knew about power, respect, and what it truly meant to be wealthy in the ways that actually mattered in life. What happened over the next hour transformed not just Christopher's evening, but something fundamental in how he understood the world and his place in it. Margaret listened as he spoke about the pressure of living up to his father's expectations, about feeling like nothing he accomplished was ever truly his own, about the loneliness that came from never knowing if people liked him for himself or for his money. She shared stories from her own life, about leaving behind her academic dreams, about building a marriage filled with love and laughter, about finding dignity in honest work and purpose in serving others. The other diners gradually returned to their own conversations, but several lingered longer than usual, as if sensing they had witnessed something rare and meaningful. The elderly gentleman who had started to stand up earlier nodded approvingly at Margaret before leaving, and the young couple near the door smiled warmly as they passed the table where an unlikely friendship was beginning to form. "You know what's funny?" Christopher said, his voice now free of the arrogance that had colored it earlier. "I learned German because my father said it would be useful for business. But you learned it because you loved the language, the literature, the culture. I think that's the difference between us. I've been taught to use everything as a tool for getting ahead, but you learned things because they brought you joy." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "There's nothing wrong with ambition, Christopher. But when we forget to value people as individuals, when we stop seeing the humanity in others, that's when we lose something essential in ourselves." As the evening wound down, Christopher did something he had never done before in a restaurant. He asked Margaret about her favorite books, her memories of Berlin, her life with James. He learned that she volunteered at a literacy center on weekends, teaching English to new immigrants, and that she was slowly writing her own memoir about the unexpected paths that lead us to where we're meant to be. When it came time to pay his bill, Christopher left a tip that was more than generous, not as a display of wealth, but as a genuine token of gratitude for a conversation that had given him more than any expensive meal ever could. But more importantly, he asked if he could come back, not as a customer looking for service, but as someone who had found in Margaret a kind of wisdom he had never encountered before. "Of course," Margaret said with a smile that had brightened countless days over her 15 years at the cafe. "But next time, maybe we can practice your German conversation. There's always room for improvement, even for those of us who think we know everything." Christopher laughed, a real laugh, free of the bitter edge that had characterized so much of his recent life. "I'd like that very much. And Margaret, thank you for not giving up on me when I clearly didn't deserve your patience." As he walked toward the door, Christopher turned back one more time. "What was it your husband used to say about people lashing out?" Margaret's eyes twinkled with the kind of wisdom that comes from a life fully lived. "That hurt people, but healed people heal people. The choice of which one we want to be is always ours to make." The door closed behind Christopher with a gentle chime, and Margaret began clearing the table where a small miracle of human connection had taken place. In her years of service, she had learned that every interaction was an opportunity to choose kindness over judgment, understanding over anger, hope over despair. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts about forgiveness and second chances, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us tonight and for believing, as Margaret does, that it's never too late for any of us to become the person we were meant to be.